You ever notice how the truth don't disappear? It just gets managed? Introducing Truthless, the official solution for inconvenient facts. Got a witness talking too much? A report that don't match the story? A timeline that starts looking a little too accurate? Relax, with Truthless, you don't fix the problem, you erase it. Our patented formula combines selective memory, institutional silence, and just a touch of chemical compliance. Side effects may include confusion, missing files, sudden accidents, and a lifetime supply of unanswered questions. And for our premium clients, we offer deluxe narrative control where facts get rewritten, witnesses get discredited, and the public gets a nice, clean bedtime story. Because let's be honest, people don't want the truth. They want something that helps them sleep at night. So the next time reality starts knocking a little too loud, just take Truthless. Truthless. Because the truth ain't the problem. People who know it are.
Pisa Verse Studios. A Palermo Productions original. Rose Cherami, Jack Ruby, and the warning they buried. The woman who knew too much before JFK was killed. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DiPrio. The president controlled a global intelligence network, but the only person who knew the assassination plot against JFK was Rose Cherami, a low-level dancer. When she singled out Jack Ruby and exposed the underworld, authorities immediately tied her to a hospital bed and locked her consciousness with sedatives. America preferred clinging to a soft lie rather than confronting the dirty truth that had surfaced from the sewers. And in the end, that truth was completely crushed under the tires of a truck speeding through the night in Texas. There was no accident. It was simply the cruel price of knowing too much. The woman on the road. The sequence of events that sealed her fate was set in motion by the very world she inhabited. Rose was a product of the southern underworld, an ecosystem controlled by Carlos Marcello, the undisputed king of the Gulf Coast Mafia. His operations spanned from New Orleans to Dallas, functioning with corporate efficiency and brutal discipline. Rose had been in Florida. She needed to get to Dallas. She was hitchhiking. Hitchhiking was a dangerous gamble for a woman alone, but desperation overrides caution. She stood by the side of the road, shivering, waiting for a set of headlights to slow down. A car pulled over. 2 men were inside. They offered her a ride. Rose got into the car. She did not know the men inside were deeply connected to the criminal underworld. The vehicle belonged to the Marcello Syndicate. It was a transport run. The men were moving a shipment of heroin and illicit cash across state lines. They were professional couriers. They were armed. They were dangerous. And they were careless. The conversation in the car. They looked at the woman sitting in their car. They saw the track marks on her arms. They saw the exhaustion in her eyes. They smelled the desperation. To them, she was not a threat. She was a ghost. She was a junkie who probably could not remember her own name, let alone comprehend a conversation. In the minds of the mobsters, she was lower than a dog. You do not stop talking when a dog is in the room. You do not lower your voice. You assume the animal lacks the capacity to understand human affairs. The men began to talk. The car sped through the Louisiana darkness. The heater hummed. The radio played low. The conversation was casual. It was the banter of tradesmen discussing an upcoming job. But their trade was murder. They talked about Dallas. They talked about the end of the week. They talked about the president. John F. Kennedy was scheduled to ride through Dealey Plaza in an open-top limousine. The men in the front seat discussed the logistics of the hit. They talked about the payout. They talked about the network that was waiting in Texas to execute the contract. They spoke with the detached professionalism of mechanics discussing an engine overhaul. They were getting paid to blow the president's head off, and they were bored with the drive, so they talked about the work. Jack Ruby's name. Rose sat in the back. The heroin was singing in her blood, pulling her toward the familiar, numb fog. But the words cut through the chemical haze. She knew Dallas. She had worked in Dallas. She knew the clubs. She knew the men who ran them. She heard a name that snapped her awake. Jack Ruby. The men in the front seat mentioned the Dallas nightclub owner. They talked about his role in the operation. They talked about the money moving through his hands. Rose knew Jack Ruby. Everyone in her line of work knew Jack Ruby. He ran the Carousel Club. He was a low-level mob associate who functioned as a pimp, an informant, and a bagman for the Marcello organization. Ruby was a violent, erratic man, desperate for respect from the real gangsters. He was the local point of contact for out-of-town muscle. She had spent nights observing him from the smoky periphery of the Carousel Club. Ruby was not a mastermind. He was a middleman, constantly sweating in his cheap suits. Rose watched him operate. She saw him slide thick envelopes and free drinks to off-duty Dallas police officers, systematically buying the local precinct's loyalty. He was a volatile man, prone to sudden outbursts against the club's dancers, yet instantly subservient the moment Marcello's lieutenants walked through the doors. To the public, Ruby was just a local eccentric desperate for attention. But from Rose's vantage point at the bottom of the hierarchy, his actual function was terrifyingly clear. He was the logistical anchor for the syndicate in Texas. If out-of-town hitmen needed clean weapons, discreet safe houses, or guaranteed police absence, Ruby handled the arrangements. Hearing his name casually mentioned by the couriers in the front seat changed everything. It meant the contract on the president was not just a rumor. It was a fully integrated, locally protected operation. The moment they realized, she heard. Rose listened. Her heart rate spiked. She was an addict, but she was not stupid. Surviving 40 years in the underworld required a sharp instinct for danger. She processed the information. The president was going to Dallas. Jack Ruby was involved. These men were part of the hit squad. The contract was real. It was happening in 2 days. She tried to remain still. She tried to keep her breathing even. She needed to maintain the illusion of the comatose junkie. She slouched against the window, closing her eyes, pretending to nod off. But fear is a physical reaction. It changes the smell of a person. It changes the tension in the air. The driver checked the rearview mirror, studying the woman in the back seat. As a professional, he instantly recognized the difference between a nodding junkie and someone holding their breath in sheer terror, noting the slight tremor in her hands and her rigid posture. He realized she was awake. He realized she was listening. He realized she understood. The atmosphere inside the car shifted instantly. The casual banter died. The silence was heavy and lethal. The two men exchanged a glance. No words were necessary. The hierarchy of their world dictated the next action. A multi-million-dollar assassination plot involving the most powerful crime syndicate in the country and rogue intelligence operatives could not be jeopardized by a streetwalker from Louisiana. The problem had to be eliminated. Thrown from the car. The driver did not pull over. Stopping the car on a dark highway left a stationary target. It left tire tracks. He kept his foot on the accelerator. The man in the passenger seat turned around. He did not pull a gun. A gunshot inside a closed vehicle was messy. It left blood on the upholstery. It left a bullet hole in the door. He used his hands. He reached into the back seat and grabbed Rose. The assault was sudden and brutally efficient. He punched her in the face. The cartilage in her nose cracked. Blood burst from her lips. Rose screamed, but the sound was trapped inside the speeding metal box. She fought back with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. She clawed at his face. She kicked at the seats. But she was malnourished, weakened by addiction, and trapped in a confined space with a trained killer. The mobster beat her systematically. He aimed for the head. He aimed for the ribs. He wanted to incapacitate her quickly. The car swerved slightly as the struggle intensified. The driver kept his eyes on the road, his grip tight on the steering wheel, completely detached from the violence happening inches away. It was a mechanical process. They were taking out the trash. Rose tasted copper, her vision blurred. The blows kept coming. She felt her consciousness slipping. The man in the passenger seat reached for the door handle. They were moving at over 60 miles an hour. The asphalt outside was a blur of gray rushing past in the dark. He shoved the door open. The roar of the wind and the tires filled the cabin. The cold air rushed in. He grabbed Rose by her bloodied hair and the collar of her jacket. He did not hesitate. He threw her out of the moving vehicle. She hit the ground. The impact was catastrophic. The human body is not designed to collide with solid asphalt at highway speeds. She rolled, tumbling violently along the rough shoulder of the road, her skin shredded against the gravel. Her bones absorbed the massive kinetic energy. She finally came to a stop in the dirt and the wet grass, a broken, bleeding mass of limbs. The car did not slow down. The red taillights faded into the distance and disappeared. The men inside did not look back. As far as they were concerned, the problem was solved. A junkie fell out of a car. It happened all the time. The warning in the rain. Rose lay in the dark. The pain was absolute. Every nerve ending screamed. She could barely breathe. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from her face into the dirt. She should have died on impact. The mobsters calculated that the fall would break her neck or crack her skull. But she did not die. The survival instinct that had kept her alive in the darkest corners of the South flared one last time. She was severely injured. She was going into shock. The withdrawal from the heroin was beginning to set in, compounding the physical agony. But her mind was clear. The words she had heard in the car burned in her brain. They were going to kill the president. Jack Ruby was involved. She forced herself to move. She dragged her broken body toward the edge of the pavement. She needed to be seen. She needed someone to stop. She lay on the white line of the highway, a bloody obstacle in the rain. Headlights pierced the darkness. A car approached. Brakes screeched. The vehicle swerved to avoid hitting her and came to a halt. A civilian had found her. The police were called. The machinery of the state was summoned to deal with the wreckage on the highway. Lieutenant Francis Fruget. Lieutenant Francis Fruget of the Louisiana State Police received the call. He was a seasoned officer. He drove to the scene expecting a routine traffic accident. He expected a drunk driver or a domestic dispute that spilled onto the asphalt. He arrived to find a woman bleeding on the road, raving in the rain. Fruget knelt beside her. He saw the track marks. He saw the cheap clothes. He instantly categorized her. He knew the type. But the woman was not complaining about her injuries. She was not asking for painkillers. She grabbed his uniform with bloody fingers. Her eyes were wide, dilated, and filled with a terror that superseded her physical pain. She began to scream. Lieutenant Francis Fruget stood on the wet asphalt of Highway 190. The flashing red and blue lights of his patrol car painted the Louisiana rain in sharp, violent strokes. He looked down at the woman. She was a broken mess of road rash and bruised tissue. Her clothes were torn, revealing the unmistakable track marks mapping the veins of her arms. Fruget was a state trooper. He had seen thousands of accidents. He had seen thousands of addicts. He possessed the hard, cynical shell required for the job. He knew how to process a scene. He knew how to categorize human wreckage. He categorized Rose Cherami instantly. She was a narcotic addict. She was a streetwalker. She was the collateral damage of the underworld. But Rose was not acting like a typical hit-and-run victim. A person thrown from a speeding car usually goes into deep shock. They are quiet. They whimper. They ask for a doctor. Rose did not ask for a doctor. She grabbed the fabric of Fruget's uniform with bloody, trembling fingers. She pulled him close. Her eyes were wide, the pupils pinned to tiny dots from the heroin, yet blazing with terrifying clarity. She screamed. She did not scream about her broken nose. She did not scream about the men who threw her out of the vehicle. She screamed about Dallas. She screamed about the president. The hospital bed. Fruget tried to calm her down. He told her an ambulance was coming. He tried to assess her physical trauma. She fought him off. She gripped his arm with desperate, surprising strength. She yelled the names. She yelled that they were going to kill John F. Kennedy. She yelled that the hit was happening in 2 days. She named Jack Ruby. She named the men in the car. She described the money. She described the timeline. Fruget listened. He processed the words. He was a good cop, which meant he recorded everything. But he was also a product of his environment. The hierarchy of credibility in 1963 was rigid. A politician was trusted. A businessman was respected. A police officer was believed. A bleeding, hysterical drug addict found on the shoulder of a highway in the middle of the night held a credibility score of absolute 0. He noted her statements in his mental ledger, but he filtered them through the lens of pathology. He assumed she was experiencing a severe narcotic-induced psychosis. He assumed the trauma of the fall had triggered a paranoid delusion. The idea that a vast, multi-million-dollar assassination plot involving the President of the United States had just been leaked to a cheap dancer on a dark Louisiana road was absurd. It defied the logic of his world. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics loaded Rose onto a stretcher. She fought the straps. She continued to scream the warning as the doors slammed shut. Fruget followed the ambulance. Protocol dictated that an injured, raving addict with no identification be taken to the nearest state facility capable of handling severe psychiatric and chemical dependency cases. They drove to Jackson, Louisiana. They drove to the East Louisiana State Hospital. Chemical straitjacket. They wheeled her into an examination room. A doctor approached with a clipboard. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask her name. He examined her physical injuries with clinical detachment. He ordered the nurses to clean the road rash and bandage her face. Then he moved to the primary issue. He looked at her arms. He saw the collapsed veins. He saw the sweat beading on her forehead. He recognized the onset of acute heroin withdrawal. Rose ignored the sting of the iodine. She ignored the ache in her bones. She focused entirely on the doctor. She pleaded with him. She told him to pick up the telephone. She told him to call the FBI. She told him to call the Secret Service. She repeated the details. The men in the car. The money. Dallas. Jack Ruby. The President. The doctor did not stop writing on his clipboard. He did not look up. He heard the words, but he did not listen to them. In his medical opinion, the content of a delusion was irrelevant. Only the presence of the delusion mattered. A patient screaming about the devil and a patient screaming about an assassination plot were treated exactly the same way. They were both exhibiting severe paranoid schizophrenia, exacerbated by chemical dependency. Rose begged them to listen. She described Jack Ruby. She described his club, the Carousel. She described how he operated as a bagman for the mob. She knew the mechanics of the Dallas underworld. She knew the hit was real because she knew the men who had the contract. She possessed actionable, specific intelligence. It was the kind of intelligence that intelligence agencies spend millions of dollars trying to acquire. The doctor sighed. He handed the clipboard to a nurse. He ordered a heavy dose of Thorazine. The nurse prepared the injection. Thorazine is an antipsychotic. It is a chemical straitjacket. It is designed to suppress the central nervous system, to slow the brain waves, to force a frantic mind into a docile, heavy stupor. Rose saw the needle. She knew what it meant. She fought harder. She knew that if they drugged her, she would not be able to speak. She knew the clock was ticking. It was the early hours of Thursday, November 21st. The hit was scheduled for Friday. The men were already in Dallas. The rifles were being cleaned. The routes were being checked. The window of opportunity to stop the murder of the century was closing rapidly. The orderlies stepped in. They were large men accustomed to subduing violent patients. They grabbed her arms. They pinned her to the examination table. The physical restriction mirrored her societal restriction. She was pinned down by the weight of a system that refused to acknowledge her existence as a rational human being. The nurse stepped forward. The needle pierced the skin of her thigh. The cold fluid entered her muscle. Rose stopped struggling. The fight left her. She stared at the ceiling. The injustice of the moment was absolute. She held the fate of the free world in her bruised head. And the world had responded by locking her in a cage and turning off her brain. November 22nd, 1963. They moved her to a solitary room in the psychiatric ward. The room was sparse, a heavy metal bed frame bolted to the floor, a thin mattress, a barred window, a solid steel door with a small observation hatch on the outside. They lifted her onto the bed. They did not trust the medication to keep her completely docile. They utilized physical restraints. They took heavy leather straps with thick steel buckles. They strapped her wrists to the rails. They strapped her ankles to the frame. They strapped her chest down. They left the room. The heavy steel door slammed shut. The lock clicked. The sound echoed in the empty corridor. Rose lay in the darkness. The Thorazine began to wash over her. It felt like a heavy, dark blanket suffocating her thoughts. Her limbs felt like lead. Her tongue felt thick and useless. But deep beneath the chemical fog, a spark of awareness remained. Through the haze of the Thorazine and the physical agony of heroin withdrawal, the timeline clicked in her mind. Friday morning dawned. November 22nd, 1963. The light filtered through the barred window of the psychiatric cell. The rain had stopped. The sky over Louisiana was gray and indifferent. Rose woke up from a fitful, drug-induced sleep. Her body ached with profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The withdrawal was peaking. The Thorazine still clouded her vision. She tested the leather straps. They held firm. She stopped fighting. The frantic energy of the highway was gone. The desperate need to warn someone had burned out, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. The clock had run out. She knew what was happening in Dallas. She could see it in her mind with terrifying clarity. She knew the route. She knew the players. She knew the outcome. She lay still on the thin mattress. She listened to the sounds of the hospital waking up. The entire country was operating on the assumption of continuity. But Rose knew the truth. She knew that in a few hours the fabric of the nation was going to be ripped apart. She lay strapped to the heavy metal frame, entirely paralyzed by the state, and waited for the gunfire to echo across the world. The bulletin. The television set in the common room of the East Louisiana State Hospital was a heavy wood-paneled box. It was tuned to a soap opera. The volume was low. The patients sat in plastic chairs, staring blankly at the flickering black and white screen. The orderly stood by the doors, bored, watching the clock. It was a Friday afternoon. November 22nd, 1963. The routine of the psychiatric ward was an engine running on idle. Down the hall, behind a locked steel door, Rose Cherami lay strapped to her bed. The Thorazine was a heavy weight on her brain. The heroin withdrawal was a fire in her joints. She was trapped between chemical apathy and physical agony. She stared at the ceiling tiles. She counted the tiny holes in the acoustic squares. She waited. At 12:40 p.m. Central Standard Time, the soap opera on the television in the common room was interrupted. The screen cut to a CBS News bulletin. Walter Cronkite appeared. He was not wearing his suit jacket. He held a piece of wire copy in his hands. His voice was steady, but the cadence was wrong. He announced that shots had been fired at the presidential motorcade in Dallas. The orderly stopped looking at the clock. The nurses stepped out from behind the medication counter. They gathered around the television. The volume was turned up. The static crackled. Minutes ticked by. The reports grew increasingly chaotic. The hospital staff stood in silence. The patients, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew restless. Then came the final bulletin. The president was dead. The ward erupted into a low murmur of shock. Nurses covered their mouths. A doctor dropped a chart on the linoleum floor. The impact of the news rippled through the institution. It was a national tragedy. A sudden, violent tear in the fabric of the country. But for one doctor standing in the hallway, the news was not just a tragedy. It was a trigger. He remembered the woman they had brought in 2 nights ago. He remembered the blood on her face. He remembered the desperate, frantic words she had screamed in the examination room. She had said they were going to Dallas. She had said they were going to kill the president. The doctor felt the blood drain from his face. He looked down the corridor toward the solitary confinement cells. The diagnosis he had written on his clipboard suddenly looked like a confession of incompetence. He had dismissed a precise, accurate, and deadly piece of intelligence as the raving of a heroin addict. He had strapped a prophet to a bed and pumped her full of tranquilizers while the assassins drove to Texas. He did not go to her room. He did not unlock her door to apologize. He walked into his office, closed the door, and sat in the dark. He was a man of science, and his science had just failed him completely. "Tell me everything." 50 miles away, Lieutenant Francis Fruget was sitting in his patrol car. The radio on his dashboard was crackling with routine traffic dispatches. Then the dispatcher broke protocol. The voice on the radio announced the assassination. Fruget gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles turned white. He was a veteran cop. He possessed a mind trained to recognize patterns, to connect desperate pieces of information. The moment the word Dallas came through the speaker, a connection slammed into place in his brain. It was a physical shock, like a punch to the chest. He saw the wet asphalt of Highway 190. He saw the battered woman pulling on his uniform. He heard her voice cutting through the rain. The men in the car. The money. Jack Ruby. Dallas. The president. Fruget hit the siren. He spun the patrol car around. He did not call his superiors. He did not request permission. He drove the accelerator to the floor. He broke every speed limit between his location and the East Louisiana State Hospital. He drove with cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer dealing with a hit and run. He was dealing with a witness to the murder of the century. He arrived at the hospital. He did not wait at the reception desk. He bypassed the administrative clerks. He walked straight into the psychiatric ward. The staff was still huddled around the television, watching the endless loop of the tragedy unfolding in Dallas. Frugier found the doctor on duty. He demanded access to the patient admitted under a psychiatric hold 2 days prior. The doctor looked at the state trooper. He saw the urgency in Frugier's eyes. The doctor nodded slowly. He handed over the keys. He did not try to defend his medical diagnosis. The gunfire in Texas had already destroyed it. Frugier walked down the corridor. He unlocked the heavy steel door. He stepped into the sparse room. Rose was awake. The heavy dose of Thorazine was wearing off. The withdrawal was making her shake against the thick leather straps. She turned her head and looked at the police officer. She saw the expression on his face. It was not the dismissive, cynical look he had worn on the highway. It was a look of absolute, horrifying realization. Rose did not need to ask. She knew. She did not smile. She did not express vindication. Being right was not a victory. Being right meant she was a target. Her prophecy was confirmed and her life expectancy had just dropped to 0. Frugier stepped forward. He did not call an orderly. He undid the buckles himself. He unstrapped her wrists. He unstrapped her ankles. He helped her sit up on the edge of the mattress. The dynamic between them was permanently altered. She was no longer street trash. She was the most valuable intelligence asset in the United States. He pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. He clicked his pen. He looked at her directly. "Tell me everything," he said. Oswald, Ruby, and the Carousel Club. Rose rubbed her bruised wrists. She looked at the closed door. She knew the danger of speaking, but she also knew the danger of silence. The men who threw her out of the car intended to kill her. They failed. They would eventually find out she was alive. Her only chance of survival was to get her testimony on the official record, to make herself too valuable to be quietly erased. She needed federal protection. She needed to trade her knowledge for her life. She began to talk. The words flowed out of her in a steady, clinical stream. The frantic hysteria from the highway was gone. She was giving a deposition. She detailed the transportation of the narcotics. She named the 2 men in the car. She described their connections to the Carlos Marcello syndicate in New Orleans. She explained the logistics of the money drops. She explained that Dallas was not just a random city. It was a crucial hub for the mob's operations in the Southwest. She detailed the local infrastructure, explaining how Jack Ruby's Carousel Club functioned as a clearinghouse for illegal activities and a safe house for out-of-town mob associates passing through Texas. Frugier wrote furiously. The details were specific. They were actionable. They were not the vague ramblings of a paranoid mind. They were the logistical realities of organized crime. Then Rose dropped the final devastating piece of the puzzle. She did not just know Jack Ruby. She knew the man they had arrested for the assassination. The television in the hospital lobby was currently broadcasting the face of Lee Harvey Oswald to the entire world. The news anchors were calling him a lone Marxist, a solitary malcontent with no connections to anyone. Rose told Frugier that was a lie. She stated she had seen Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby sitting together at the Carousel Club. She had seen them drinking together. She had seen them talking in the back booths, away from the loud music and the stage lights. She described the dynamic. Oswald was quiet, intense. A young man who thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. Ruby was sweating, nervous, eager to please the men higher up the chain. They were not strangers. They were associates. They were working on the same payroll. Frugier stopped writing. He stared at the bruised woman sitting on the hospital bed. The implications of her statement were staggering. If Oswald and Ruby knew each other, the entire narrative being constructed by the authorities in Dallas was a complete fabrication. Oswald was not a lone wolf. He was a hired gun. The assassination was a conspiracy. And the local police, heavily infiltrated by Ruby's bribes, were right in the middle of it. The report that vanished. Rose explained the mechanics of the hit. Oswald was the designated shooter, but he was also the designated fall guy. He was the patsy. The mob needed a target to offer the police, a distraction to allow the real architects of the murder to walk away clean. They chose Oswald because of his bizarre, highly publicized defection to the Soviet Union and his pro-Castro activism in New Orleans. He was the perfect geopolitical decoy. He looked like a communist threat, which effectively hid the organized crime reality. Frugier closed his notepad. He had enough. He had more than enough. He had the names, the locations, the relationships, and the motive. He had a direct witness to the conspiracy planning stages. He promised Rose he would protect her. He told the hospital staff to keep her locked down. No visitors. No phone calls. She was now a material witness in a presidential assassination. Frugier left the hospital. He drove back to his precinct. He sat at his typewriter. He inserted a carbon sheet between two pieces of official state police stationery. He began to type the report. He typed the name Jack Ruby. He typed the name Lee Harvey Oswald. He typed the name Carlos Marcello. He documented the timeline of the highway incident. He documented the exact words Rose had spoken 2 days before the bullets were fired in Dealey Plaza. He finished the report. He signed it. He handed it to his commanding officer. The report was then transmitted through the official channels. It moved from the Louisiana State Police to the federal authorities. It was directed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and ultimately to the Warren Commission, the blue ribbon panel established by the government to investigate the death of the president. Frugier believed he had just handed the federal government the key to breaking the conspiracy wide open. He expected a team of federal agents to arrive at the hospital within hours to take Rose into protective custody. He expected his report to become the cornerstone of a massive national investigation. He waited. Days turned into weeks. No federal agents arrived in Jackson, Louisiana. No one came to interview Rose Cherami. No one called Lieutenant Frugier to verify his notes. The silence from Washington was absolute and terrifying. The cleanup. Frugier watched the television. He watched Jack Ruby walk into the basement of the Dallas Police Headquarters and shoot Lee Harvey Oswald in the stomach on live national television. The newscasters called it an act of patriotic vigilante justice. Ruby claimed he did it to spare the president's widow the pain of a trial. Frugier knew it was a mob cleanup operation. He knew Ruby was silencing Oswald before Oswald could negotiate a deal. He knew Ruby was tying up the loose end that Rose had described in the hospital room. The murder of Oswald was the final confirmation of everything she had said. Yet the silence from the government continued. The Warren Commission began its hearings. They called hundreds of witnesses. They analyzed the bullet trajectories. They measured the windows of the Texas School Book Depository. They spent millions of dollars generating a massive multi-volume report. But they did not call Rose Cherami. They did not enter Lieutenant Fruget's report into the official record. The report vanished. It was not lost in the mail. It was not misplaced in a filing cabinet. It was actively, deliberately suppressed. The system had received the truth, analyzed its implications, and decided the truth was too dangerous to survive. The United States government, currently fighting the Cold War and trying to project an image of absolute stability to the world, could not afford a conspiracy. If they admitted the president was murdered by a domestic criminal syndicate working in tandem with rogue intelligence operatives, the public trust in the state would collapse. The nation would tear itself apart. The government required a simple, comforting lie to restore order. They required Lee Harvey Oswald to be a lone, deranged Marxist. They required Jack Ruby to be a grieving, emotional nightclub owner. They did not require a Louisiana prostitute who could prove they were all working together. Lieutenant Fruget realized his report was deliberately suppressed to maintain the lone wolf narrative, knowing that pushing the issue would end his career or worse. He chose to survive and kept quiet. Highway 155. Back at the East Louisiana State Hospital, Rose waited for the protection that Fruget had promised. It never came. The hospital eventually discharged her. Her injuries healed enough for her to walk out the heavy steel doors. She walked back out into the world that had tried to kill her, entirely unprotected, carrying a secret that made her a walking target. She knew they would come for her. She knew Carlos Marcello did not leave loose ends. She had survived the highway. She had survived the psychiatric ward. But she was a woman marked for death in a country where the police and the killers were looking the other way. She returned to the underground. She moved through the shadows of the South, looking over her shoulder, waiting for the headlights to find her in the dark. 1963 turned into 1964. By 1965, the Warren Commission had published its heavy, definitive volumes. The government had officially decreed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. The case was closed. The files were sealed. The public returned to their televisions and their daily lives. But for Rose Cherami, time did not move forward. Her execution was only a matter of time. She lived in the vast, invisible underbelly of the American South. She moved through the cheap motels of Louisiana and Texas. She paid for rooms with cash. She used fake names. She kept the curtains drawn. She was a woman walking on a razor wire, balancing her crippling heroin addiction with the absolute certainty that she was being hunted. Carlos Marcello did not forget. A mafia boss does not achieve total dominance over the Gulf Coast by leaving loose ends untied. Rose had spoken to a state trooper. She had put names on an official record. The government had suppressed the report, but Marcello knew that records could be unearthed. An ambitious prosecutor, a rogue journalist, a shift in political winds. Any of these could turn a suppressed police report into a federal indictment. As long as Rose had a pulse and a voice, she was a liability. The syndicate was patient. They did not launch a massive, noisy manhunt. They used the network. They put the word out to the club owners, the drug dealers, the pimps, and the corrupt beat cops. They waited for her addiction to force her out into the open. Heroin requires money, and money requires a transaction. Every transaction was a flare sent up in the dark. By September 1965, the exhaustion was absolute. Running requires resources. It requires energy. Rose was out of both. Her body was failing. The constant paranoia eroded her mind. She was 42 years old, but the mirror showed a woman decades older. In the early hours of September 4th, 1965, the trap finally closed. Rose was walking along Highway 155 near the small town of Big Sandy, Texas. It was a desolate stretch of asphalt. The pine trees flanked the road, creating a tunnel of absolute darkness. There were no streetlights. There were no witnesses. It was the perfect environment for an extraction. A car approached. It did not speed past. It slowed down. Rose knew. A hunted animal recognizes the predator before the teeth sink in. She did not run into the woods. She did not scream. There was no one to hear her. The car stopped. The doors opened. The men who stepped onto the gravel shoulder were not there to offer a ride. They were professionals. They were mechanics sent to dismantle a problem, staged as an accident. They did not pull guns, knowing a gunshot wound turns a corpse into a homicide investigation, drawing detectives, forensics, and the press. The Marcello Syndicate required a clean disposal. They required a death that the local authorities would categorize as a tragic, mundane accident. The United States has a massive network of highways. Every year, thousands of people die on the asphalt. Drunk drivers, sleeping truckers, pedestrians walking in the dark. A body crushed on a highway is a statistical normality. It is a paperwork exercise for a rural sheriff. That was the operational parameter. One of the men approached Rose. He held a heavy, solid steel object, a tire iron or a heavy wrench. The weapon was specifically chosen for its blunt, devastating force. The strike was surgical and instantaneous. The man swung the steel bar. It connected with the side of Rose's head. The impact shattered her temporal bone. It was a crushing, localized fracture. The blunt force trauma instantly disconnected her brain from her nervous system. She did not feel the asphalt when she fell. She dropped to the shoulder of the highway unconscious, bleeding heavily from the catastrophic head wound. She was still breathing, but the murder was only in its preparatory phase. The men dragged her limp body onto the active lane of Highway 155. They did not just leave her in a heap. They positioned her. They laid her completely flat, perpendicular to the flow of traffic. They arranged her body directly in the path of the tires. They stepped back into the shadows. They waited. They did not have to wait long. The highway was a major artery for commercial trucking. Heavy freight moved through the Texas night. A massive vehicle approached, the driver, sitting high in the cab, pushing 70 miles per hour through the darkness, had no time to react. He saw a shape on the road. By the time his foot hit the air brakes, the heavy rubber tires had already rolled over the obstacle. The massive weight of the commercial truck tire instantly crushed her skull and shattered her ribcage, collapsing her lungs. The organs ruptured, the spine snapped. The execution was completed. The vehicle did not stop. The driver, terrified or perhaps unaware of exactly what he had hit in the pitch black, kept going. The hitmen returned to their car. They put the vehicle in gear. They drove away. The ledger was balanced. The witness was erased. The autopsy they ignored. Morning broke over Big Sandy. The local police received a call about a body on the highway. A patrol car arrived. The officer stepped out into the Texas heat. They looked at the mangled remains on the asphalt. They saw the torn clothes. They saw the blood. The officers processed the scene with the expected rural apathy. They did not close the highway for a grid search. They did not look for signs of a struggle on the gravel shoulder. They did not measure skid marks. They looked at the crushed chest and the tire tracks. They pulled out their notepads. They wrote down the standard conclusion. Pedestrian struck by a hit-and-run vehicle. It was the easiest conclusion. It required the least amount of paperwork. They called the county coroner. The body was scraped off the asphalt, placed in a heavy bag, and transported to the morgue. The local newspaper ran a tiny brief about an unidentified woman killed in a traffic accident. The plan executed by the Marcello Syndicate was functioning flawlessly. The murder had successfully camouflaged itself as a statistic. But the perfect crime encountered a temporary snag in the sterile, brightly lit room of the county morgue. The medical examiner unzipped the body bag. He was a pathologist. His job was to read the dead. A body is a ledger of trauma. Every cut, every break, every bruise tells a story about the velocity, angle, and nature of the impact. The pathologist began the autopsy, expecting the standard markers of a pedestrian traffic fatality. When a standing human being is struck by a moving vehicle, the body absorbs the kinetic energy in a highly predictable sequence. Forensics calls it Waddell's triad. First, the heavy steel bumper strikes the lower legs, shattering the tibia and fibula. Second, the torso slams into the hood or windshield of the vehicle, causing massive internal injuries to the chest and abdomen. Third, the victim is thrown violently forward or over the roof, striking their head on the pavement. The pathologist looked at Rose Cherami's lower legs. The bones were intact. There were no bumper fractures. There were no massive hematomas on the calves or knees. He moved to the torso. The chest was entirely crushed. The ribs were pulverized, but the bruising and the damage were not the result of a horizontal impact from a blunt object like a car grill. The damage was a vertical compression. The tire treads were literally stamped across the crushed tissue of the chest. Then he examined the skull. The skull presented two entirely different mechanisms of trauma. The first was the catastrophic crushing damage consistent with a heavy commercial tire rolling directly over the bone. But beneath that massive destruction, the pathologist found something else. He found a distinct, localized, deep puncture fracture on the side of the head. It was a precise wound shaped like a star, driven deep into the brain cavity. This specific fracture could not be caused by a flat tire rolling over a head. It could not be caused by a head striking flat asphalt. It was the signature of a high-velocity strike from a localized heavy blunt instrument, a tire iron, a wrench, a steel pipe. Furthermore, the pathologist noted the complete lack of horizontal velocity injuries. A body struck by a car doing 60 miles an hour is thrown. Skin is scraped across the road for dozens of yards. Clothing is shredded in a specific directional pattern. Rose's body did not show these markers. Her clothing was relatively intact except where the tire had crushed it. Her skin did not have the massive directional road rash of a thrown body. The medical examiner stepped back from the stainless steel table. The forensic evidence was undeniable. It completely contradicted the police report. Rose Cherami was not struck while walking down the highway. The lack of lower leg fractures proved she was not standing. The deep, localized puncture wound to the skull proved she had been struck with a heavy weapon. The vertical compression of the chest and the lack of throwing injuries proved she was lying completely flat and stationary on the road when the vehicle ran her over. The pathologist dictated his findings into the official autopsy report. He documented the blunt force trauma to the skull. He documented that the trauma occurred before the crushing injuries. He officially stated that the victim was lying horizontal on the pavement before any vehicular contact was made. He concluded that the fatal sequence of events began with an assault. It was a forensic masterpiece. The pathologist had looked through the camouflage and seen the murder. He typed the report, signed his name, and sent it to the local police department and the district attorney's office. He handed the law enforcement apparatus the exact physical proof needed to open a homicide investigation. The police received the report. They read the pathologist's conclusions. They saw the words indicating assault and pre-vehicular trauma. They ignored it. The dead end. The local sheriff's department did not dispatch detectives to Highway 155. They did not search for the blunt instrument. They did not open a murder file. They took the autopsy report, placed it in a manila folder, and buried it in a filing cabinet. They maintained the official classification of a hit-and-run traffic accident. The suppression of the autopsy report was not necessarily a grand coordinated conspiracy involving the local police and the mafia. It was often something much more banal and equally insidious. It was bureaucratic inertia. A hit-and-run is a closed file. A murder with no witnesses, no suspects, and a transient addicted victim is an open file. Open files drain resources. They lower clearance rates. They generate paperwork. The local authorities looked at Rose Cherami and saw a woman who did not matter. They saw a victim who had no family demanding justice, no high-priced lawyers applying pressure. They chose the path of least resistance. But whether driven by active corruption or passive apathy, the result was exactly what Carlos Marcello required. The system functioned as a dead end. Rose Cherami was buried in a cheap, unmarked grave. The earth was shoveled over her broken body, and the silence that the mob had demanded was finally achieved. The warning she had screamed in the psychiatric ward was sealed away in forgotten police files. The forensic evidence proving her execution was locked in a basement. The men who beat her on the highway, the men who crushed her skull in Texas, and the men who shot the president in Dallas walked away clean. The House Select Committee. For 2 years, the silence held. The Warren Commission had published its 26 volumes. Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin. Jack Ruby was an impulsive patriot. The case was closed. The federal government shifted its attention to the escalating conflict in Vietnam, and the American public was encouraged to move past the trauma of Dallas. Rose Cherami's ghost was once again banished to the archives. The mafia couriers who threw her from the car remained unidentified. The men who crushed her skull in Texas were never pursued. Jack Ruby died in prison of a sudden, rapidly advancing cancer before he could be granted a new trial. Carlos Marcello continued to rule the Gulf Coast, expanding his real estate holdings and his illicit enterprises, entirely untouched by the investigations into the assassination of the 35th president. In 1976, responding to mounting public pressure, Congress established the House Select Committee on Assassinations to reopen the JFK investigation, specifically looking into the potential involvement of organized crime. The HSCA investigators traveled to Louisiana. They interviewed Lieutenant Francis Fruget again. They reviewed his original testimony. They looked at the timeline. The committee could not ignore the documentation. The police dispatch logs proved that Fruget had indeed picked up Rose Cherami on Highway 190 on November 20th, 1963. The hospital admission records proved she was placed on a psychiatric hold before the assassination. The timeline was indisputable. The committee then turned its attention to her death. They requisitioned the original autopsy report from Texas. They assigned independent, world-class forensic pathologists to review the findings. Dr. John Nichols, a prominent forensic pathologist, examined the 1965 report. He did not look at Rose's arrest record. He did not care about her history of prostitution. He looked exclusively at the biomechanics of bone, tissue, and steel. Dr. Nichols systematically dismantled the hit-and-run classification. He focused entirely on the specific fracture pattern on the skull. He explained the medical science of a stellate fracture. A stellate fracture is a star-shaped break in the bone, radiating outward from a central point of impact. It requires a high-velocity, concentrated strike with a heavy, blunt object. It cannot be caused by the broad, flat distribution of weight from a pneumatic rubber tire. It cannot be caused by a human head falling from a standing position and striking a flat surface like asphalt. Furthermore, Dr. Nichols analyzed the condition of the torso, the severe vertical compression, the crushed rib cage, and the absence of directional scraping or Waddell's triad injuries confirmed the initial pathologist's findings. The victim was unconscious and lying horizontally on the pavement when the vehicle rolled over her. Dr. Nichols submitted his medical conclusion to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He stated unequivocally that the forensic evidence pointed entirely toward murder. He testified that Rose Cherami was struck with a heavy weapon, incapacitated, and then deliberately placed in the path of oncoming highway traffic to ensure death and obscure the initial assault. The science was irrefutable. The federal government now possessed an official, independent medical analysis confirming that the woman who predicted the JFK assassination was systematically executed 2 years later. The mechanics of the truth were finally on the table. Buried in the appendices. The committee had the timeline, the police logs, the hospital records, and the forensic proof of an orchestrated murder. They had the motive, they had the names of the syndicate involved. It was the exact combination of evidence required to officially declare that Carlos Marcello's organization had active prior knowledge of the plot to kill the president, and that they had utilized lethal force to silence a witness. But the HSCA, despite its mandate, was still a political entity. It was composed of politicians who understood the explosive, destabilizing nature of the truth. If the committee officially concluded that the mafia killed the president and then executed witnesses on American highways with total impunity, it would require a massive, unprecedented federal response. It would require the Justice Department to indict the heads of the Cosa Nostra for treason and assassination. It would expose the historical complicity of the FBI, which had deliberately ignored the mafia for decades. It would demand a reckoning the system was not prepared to handle. The committee had to find a way to acknowledge the evidence without acting upon it. They had to manage the truth, compartmentalize it, and neutralize its explosive potential. The solution was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. The HSCA issued its final report in 1979. In a startling departure from the Warren Commission, the committee concluded that President Kennedy was likely assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. They concluded that organized crime elements likely had the motive, means, and opportunity to participate in the plot. However, they did not name Carlos Martello as the architect. They did not issue criminal indictments. And regarding Rose Cherami, they employed the ultimate tactic of historical burial. They did not ignore Dr. Nichols' forensic findings. They accepted his conclusion that she was likely murdered. They accepted Lieutenant Fruget's testimony that she had warned of the assassination. But they placed all of this devastating information in the deep, unread appendices of the committee's massive, multi-volume report. They buried the execution of Rose Cherami under thousands of pages of ballistic charts, acoustic analyses, and administrative transcripts. They acknowledged her death was a homicide, but they officially concluded that there was insufficient evidence to definitively link her murder to the assassination of the president. They looked at a woman who named the killers 48 hours before the event, who detailed the Dallas mob infrastructure, and who was subsequently assassinated in a staged accident to ensure her silence, and they classified it as a coincidence. The system functioned exactly as it had in the local Texas Sheriff's Office in 1965, only on a much grander, federally funded scale. The HSCA provided the illusion of an investigation. They gathered the facts, bound them in heavy leather volumes, placed them on a shelf in the National Archives, and closed the door. They turned a targeted geopolitical assassination into a footnote. Rose Cherami was officially acknowledged and simultaneously officially dismissed. The state conceded that she was right, and conceded that she was murdered, but refused to administer justice. The final audit. While the HSCA reports were gathering dust in Washington, Carlos Marcello continued to eat pasta on the porch of Churchill Farms. He was aging, but he was free. He watched the federal committees come and go. He watched the politicians debate the trajectories of bullets. He understood that the committees were theater. They were designed to appease the public, not to dismantle the power structures of the underworld. Marcello knew that power is not about what is true. Power is about what can be enforced. He had enforced his will in Dallas in 1963. He had enforced his will on Highway 155 in 1965. The government could write all the reports it wanted, but the government had not arrested him for the blood on his hands. The syndicate had outmaneuvered the United States government. They had killed the commander-in-chief, executed the witnesses, and watched the state tie itself in knots trying to cover it up. Rose Cherami was left in her unmarked grave. The tire tracks on her chest sealed the state's official narrative, permanently burying her warning in an unmarked grave. She was a woman who had tried to stop the apocalypse, and her reward was to be labeled a crazy junkie by the media, ignored by the FBI, and finally bludgeoned to death on a dark road by men who knew the police would not care. In the calculating ledger of organized crime, the assassination in Dallas was viewed by many investigators as a capital expenditure to remove a powerful impediment. Lee Harvey Oswald was a disposable asset. Jack Ruby was the middle manager tasked with liquidating him. Rose Cherami, however, was an anomaly. She was a variable the operation failed to calculate. The hit and run on Highway 155 was widely theorized to be their final audit, closing her account with extreme prejudice. The tragedy is that the institutional bureaucracy allowed it to happen. The unredacted forensic data now stands as a permanent scar on the official record, proving that beneath the sanitized history of the 20th century, crucial truths were systematically erased on a dark Texas road. Rose Cherami was not powerful. She was not polished. She was not protected by a title, a badge, a press pass, or a famous last name. And that is exactly why the system thought it could erase her. She came from the bottom of the underworld, from the places America pretends do not exist. But sometimes the people closest to the dirt are the ones who hear the truth first. Rose heard the wrong conversation in the wrong car with the wrong men, and for that, she became a walking death sentence. She warned them. She named Dallas. She named Jack Ruby. She named the machinery before the machinery fired. And instead of listening, they drugged her, strapped her down, dismissed her, buried her report, and then buried her body. That is the horror of this story. Not just that Rose Cherami knew too much, but that the people in power knew she knew too much, and still chose the lie. If you want more stories like this, the dark roads, the missing files, the buried witnesses, and the people erased because they stood too close to the truth, stay with us. Because around here, we do not polish the official version. We pull it apart. We check the tires. We follow the money. And we remember the names they tried to bury. Thank you for watching. From Pizzaverse Studios, a Palermo Productions original. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent DePrio. We appreciate you. Stay sharp. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous witness in history is the one nobody thinks matters. Rose Cherami, a woman the system called a junkie, so they didn't have to call her what she actually was, right? Heard a presidential hit being planned, screamed it to the cops, got drugged, ignored, and later turned into roadkill paperwork. Yeah, crazy, sure. Jack Ruby, a sweaty nightclub owner who just happened to walk into a police basement and shoot the most important suspect in America on live TV. Totally random, totally emotional, definitely not a cleanup guy with connections. Lee Harvey Oswald, the official lone wolf. You know, the guy who somehow had connections everywhere, history with intelligence circles, and then conveniently got silenced before he could talk. But yeah, sure acted alone. Of course he did. Carlos Marcello, the Gulf Coast boss who ran things like a Fortune 500 company, except the product was crime. Suspected by investigators for decades, but somehow always just out of reach. Funny how that works when the system don't feel like looking. Francis Fruge, the one cop who actually listened, wrote it all down, handed it up the chain, and then watched it disappear into the void. Did his job too well, which in this case, that's a career hazard. John F. Kennedy, the most powerful man in the world, riding through Dallas in an open car like it was a parade instead of a target range. Surrounded by security, intelligence, and government, and still the only one who didn't get the warning.
You ever meet a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy, and somehow, by the end of the story, he is the guy. Yeah, introducing the Proximity King experience. For a limited time, you too can enjoy the lifestyle of someone who was technically in the same zip code as power. With the Proximity King package, you get one extended family connection, marriage counts, we ain't picky. Unlimited name drops, Messino this, Vitale that, no verification required. Strategic vagueness system. Never say what you did, just imply you were around when it happened. But wait, it gets better. Upgrade to the deluxe storyteller tier. And will include contradiction flex technology. Your stories can change depending on the audience. Safe detail filter, never accidentally reveal anything real. Aura builder, sit back, pause, look serious, and let people fill in the blanks for you. Why risk actual consequences when you can just borrow the atmosphere? And remember, real guys leave records, but with Proximity King, you leave with impressions, no paperwork, no wiretaps, no problems. So if you've ever wanted to be respected, mysterious, and just believable enough to not get questioned, the Proximity King experience. Because why live the life when you can just talk about it? Product not responsible for fact-checking, federal records, or anyone from Brooklyn asking follow-up questions. Side effects may include Reddit threads, skepticism, and sudden loss of credibility. Proximity King, we don't prove it, we imply it.
How'd that cross necklace get over your horns? You know the saying, I bet you be sweating like a whore in church, spending too much time trying to hide behind the Bible. Get in front of it, find out that Jesus was a foreigner. Virgin Mary, you would've deported her. Not before your husband found out she was a minor, he'd have ordered her. Him and his buddies would've recorded her, transported her, extorted her, and then sent her to the coroner. You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. I'm pretty sure that God's annoyed of racists bringing him up. Sick of you chumps showing up to take a sip of the cup. You called the Aztec savages, but the cup, isn't it blood? Isn't the stuff symbolic? Oh, it's different, huh? Introduction to blood sacrifice. He died so you can't commit your crimes. Here's the hoping he come back to life. I can't wait to see the face on every single preacher's wife. All them secrets you've been keeping, tell me how you sleep at night. All them evil things you feeling, don't leave cause you be polite. Cause this even and the thieving ain't concealed as recondite. Only a few people know. And you know why they keep it tight. You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. Weaponized all of it, don't know what a proverb is. Cherry picking Bible scripts, oh my God. Arrogance, lying in the Lord names ain't honoring. Pride leading the blind again, oh my God. You must be drunk off the blood of Christ. Or maybe you just back hitting the hooch again. Or back to cosplaying a hooligan. The grip, the cross, to get the dollars like what? Now you forgot where you and your hoochie been? You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians. You don't get to pray for me. You won't let your heart out of this one. I know that your hate runs deep. God is probably tired of getting name dropped by fake Christians.